old Japanese-only mobile games. They're possibly one of the biggest pits of lost media in video games. They tend to be tied to specific hardware, and many of them are just entirely forgotten. Sometimes, if the series is big enough, there will be some record. The existence of a Final Fantasy VII and some Kingdom Hearts mobile games are fairly well known. From Software still lists the old Armored Core mobile games on the series timeline, and old Monster Hunter fans who spend enough time on the wiki have probably found out that some Monster Hunter mobile games existed too. But Etrian Odyssey, well, a lot of people don't even know this series exists, so it's really not surprising that its mobile game has only a few records on the English-speaking internet. It's not mentioned on the game's wiki or on Wikipedia. Heck, it barely gets a footnote on the game's Japanese Wikipedia page. Of course, I haven't played it either, and probably won't ever have a good chance to play it. So instead, I want to just highlight some stuff from a playthrough blog by
Bo Soregashi.
And yes, the playthrough is in Japanese, unsurprisingly. So this will basically be from the Google translated version of it. Now, this is obviously going to make this far from a stellar video on the subject, but right now at least it'll be the only video on the subject. As I said, this game's very existence is barely recorded. The most notable references I can find to it in English are scattered. Very small posts such as a short Reddit thread or some social media posts. There are some of the music tracks on YouTube, and there is a brief entry on the series TV tropes page that happens to point to the very same playthrough I used for this video, so at least I'm not the only English speaker to find this source. And hell, there's not a lot of info in Japanese either. This playthrough is probably the most complete Japanese resource on the game. So until someone can create a better English record of this game, I will do what I can to at least raise awareness of it. Consider this a second-hand source in a historical sense. If you think you can make a better one, be my guest. Or, if you're not satisfied with this, read through the blog with Google Translate. I actually really recommend it. It's a great glimpse into this weird, forgotten game. The opening scroll speaks of pioneers arriving to a new continent. The forest around which they settle is oppressive, and it's nicknamed the Forest Jail. And in the center of the forest is a towering tree. On the night of the new moon, something is unleashed, and the villagers all disappear without any sign of bloodshed. A few months later, a team is sent from the homeland to investigate, including adventurers such as you. So you set off from a small encampment called Jail Rock. While it's not even really a permanent settlement, it's the village for this game and contains all you'd expect from the early games. Yes, that includes a separate doctor who will charge you a lot for reviving KO'd characters. Try not to die. In that vein, it's worth noting that this game is heavily based on Etrian Odyssey 1. The mechanics, most notably, and also the class selection, skill trees, and the graphics for the classes are heavily based on the first game. Although Ronin and Hexer, according to this, are available from the start, the game, according to Japanese Wikipedia, only released a couple months after Etrian Odyssey 2, so it's safe to assume that it was developed concurrently and didn't really have the chance to adapt anything from the second game, especially not for core mechanics like classes. And so we start off with Stratum 1. Unsurprisingly, it starts with a mapping mission in a pretty standard forest stratum. Although the playthrough does highlight some FOEs. Most enemies in this game are ripped straight from the first game. There's a fair few number of recolors too, and there's a scarce few enemies that are actually original designs. They will jump out at you when you see them. Also interestingly, some FOEs seem to be encountered two at a time, or I think later we even get larger groups. There will be one sort of, encounter ball on the map, but when you get into the fight, there will be two enemies there. Also, apparently, the playthrough mentions that all the rare drops here are pure RNG, no conditional drops, so that's not particularly fun. Because this game lacks the side events that are normally a staple of this series, there's not a ton to cover here. So we're right on to the boss. The boss of the first stratum is a Queen Hornet. The main details mentioned are a super rush attack that seems to hit the entire party, and the fact that she receives reinforcements from guard bee foes, fitting for the Queen. It's nice to start off on a completely original boss. Why do I point this out when it seems like it should be assumed? Well, you'll see. On to the next stratum, and apparently geomagnetic fields look like spheres in this game. I guess that's one way to make them even less visually intensive. Anyway, the second stratum's theme seems to just be dark forest. It does look kinda cool though, and it gets the excellent title of Labyrinth of Everlasting Darkness, even though there is still a day-night cycle. But apparently there's no new music here, which I feel like that would get very disappointing very quickly, since the new musics are kind of a key part of setting the stage for each stratum. Continuing a trend of just taking the enemies from the corresponding stratum in Etrian Odyssey 1, the enemies are mostly from the second stratum of that game. Thematically it fits at least, but apparently they do not waste any time, hitting you with a lot of tough enemies normally found later in the second stratum of the first game, right from the first floor of this one. The person making the blog had to slow down to grind foes and the boss in the previous stratum, and later it seems that because of this, the normal enemies don't really change throughout a stratum. And now we start to see a bit of the game just being kind of randomly weird with the progression, which at least means I'll have more to talk about. The player hits a dead end on the 8th floor due to an insurmountable foe. Then they get a mission about this and are sent to a staircase down on the 7th floor. This newly appeared staircase is only a few steps from the regular stairs down, and for some strange reason is in the northernmost row of tiles. For those not familiar with the series, the outermost edge of the map is basically always left as empty white space. And just to make it even a little extra strange, this takes you all the way down to the 9th floor. This really is a game that does just things kind of at random, unconcerned with franchise conventions. Coming out so early before those conventions were really established helps, I guess, but it still just kind of picks the most random ways to be unique. Speaking of picking the most random ways to be unique, there's no boss on the 10th floor. Instead, you fight the boss on the 11th floor, the first floor of the third stratum. It's a golem, though here it is called a silver guard instead. It's apparently rather difficult and did require a bit of grinding on the player's part to beat it. And now that the 11th floor can be explored properly, we start the third stratum. And it's a nice level. There are some areas that seem to function as conveyor belt floors, not ice floors, conveyor belt floors, and there's also damage floors later on. In one of the game's less pleasant oddities, there's items at gathering points in this area that are basically just trash that sells for 5 entel. They're apparently just rocks or twigs, but you gather them and sell them anyway, apparently. But now we're getting to the really interesting point. Yes, finally, I wanted to be thorough, okay? The player is sent for a mission on the 8th floor, and here they have to fight a new FOE, completely new to this game in fact. A fire element enemy named Ifrit with a unique graphic and a very strange design. Even in-universe it's seen as completely alien. This also rewards a sword called the Flame Tongue. It's apparently rather useful since it deals ranged fire damage and can be equipped by anyone. So it's a pretty good option if you want your backline characters to be able to deal a bit more damage with normal attacks. Then a bit later, we get another piece of severe weirdness. More the kind of weirdness we had on Stratum 2, though. First off, the third stratum lasts for 10 floors, going all the way down to floor 20. It is the only stratum in the game that does this. And while there's no geomagnetic field, there is a major shortcut. There were stairs down near the 11th floor geomagnetic field, and they take the player down all the way to the 16th floor in a very tiny room that, while empty, does have a shortcut that can be unlocked from the other side. So once you get to the 16th floor normally, you can just warp to the 11th floor and then take these stairs to get back into it. I gotta say, I'm not a big fan of this design choice. It reminds me of the shrines in Nexus that overstayed their welcome, and those at least had the dignity to split themselves up throughout the game. I'd say that even as a fan who is accustomed to spending a while in the same stratum, 10 floors in a row is simply too tedious. Also worth noting is that a short way into the 16th stratum there's apparently a very accessible fountain of recovery. Then there's another quest foe, which is this derpy looking two-headed snake. It's not helped by the low image quality we're dealing with, but the monsters in this game feel like they're sometimes a bit incoherent in their design. They don't feel like they're from the same game as each other, much less from the same game as the actual Etrian Odyssey monsters. And then the third stratum boss on floor 20 is a gold golem, or golden gate guard. I guess it's kind of neat to have a silver boss at the start of the stratum and then a gold boss at the end, but it's also kind of lame that they did this with palette swaps. It also apparently wasn't too hard. But with that out of the way, the award for stratum most worthy of being on a metal album cover goes to the fourth stratum. It's got a lava theme, and frankly I think it looks better than the third game's volcanic stratum, even with the lowered graphical power. There's just a really cool style to it with the darker tones of the rocks and the jagged spikes. It also seems that between the player ending up a little over-leveled and other factors, this section ends up being easier than the last stratum. There's also this weird thing where if you take the stairs up from the 21st floor, you end up on the 15th floor. It's mentioned in story, so it's not a bug or anything. It's honestly really weird in combination with the fact that this means it's dropping you off where you normally would go if you went from the fourth stratum to the third stratum, as if the extra floors of the third stratum just weren't there. It makes me wonder if they were trying to go for some sort of insinuation of something narrative here, but the story never really goes that in depth, so we're kind of left to wonder on this. But that aside, the fourth stratum is pretty uneventful until the 24th floor, where there's a new variant of Ifrit that shows up. There's also yet another on the 25th floor too. The story does start to develop with the idea that one character's brother was researching ancient machinery and might have found something tied to another world, and this might be the source of Ifrit and such. There's also an amusing side quest boss fight with the immortal butterfly, a boss that is totally immune to physical attacks. Of course, it's also just a recolored butterfly enemy. As you could probably tell at this point, the game really does seem to rely on palette swaps a bit much, even for a JRPG, a genre that admittedly does fall back on them a lot. In fact, the boss for the fourth stratum is just a red stalker. There's then a bit more story, and there's mention that specially marked doors on the 10th and 20th floors might have been connected to the phenomenon of people being spirited away, as the Google Translate calls it. And so this is where the story starts to pick up a bit, at least as much as it ever will. And I should warn that this is where things get into spoilers, not just for this game, you're probably never going to get to play this game, but there's also some allusions to the series as a whole. But if you know the big twist from the fifth stratum of the first game, don't worry about it. You know everything you need to. Alright, so this is the fifth stratum of an Etrian Odyssey game, so you all know what that means, right? That's right, this is the twist where we reveal that Etrian Odyssey is a sci-fi setting all along. The stratum is called the World Tree Core, and it's rather interesting. The ruins are overgrown with vines, but the floor is very clearly metal, making this place clearly more technological in nature. We're here to find the vanguard that went into the forest at first, but what we find are enemies that are stated to be the mutated forms of the vanguard, though they're just recolored from the forest folk enemies of the first game. They're also apparently pretty strong, and you have to fight 3 groups of them, so there's that too. You then find out that Freen, the girl with the missing brother, has entered the labyrinth by herself. The party goes to find her, but ends up fighting another Ifrit-type monster on the 3rd floor trying to rescue her. While she disappears after this fight, you later save her after you fight the 5th Stratum's boss, which is just a recolored Ifrit. Yes, another one. Then the game slows down a bit before you can actually progress to the 6th Stratum. The game does seem to do this sometimes, slowing down progress to focus on story. There's a brief encounter with Freen's brother before the player has to fight a boss fight with a recolored version of the Forest Folk spellcaster. You learn that the country from which this expedition originated already knew this location was connected to another world. The intention was to use the lost technology here for military purposes, but apparently they didn't want anyone to know too much, so that fight with the recolored Forest Folk caster was actually someone from the home country sent to kill you and Freen's brother for knowing too much. And now they're going to the 6th Stratum to try and take control of the system here. But it's decided to stop them because this technology here is too dangerous. So we must go into the deepest part of the labyrinth, the 6th Stratum. So first off, the obvious weird thing here is that the 6th Stratum is part of the main story. That never happens in the series outside of a small preview of the 6th Stratum in one game in the 3DS era. But don't worry, it gets weirder immediately. This might be the strangest Stratum in the entire franchise, and I mean this in a good way. The walls and floor are completely black with purple glowing geometric patterns in them. It's a design that blatantly screams cyberspace to anyone who's seen a depiction of cyberspace since Tron. And as progress is made, you can see through the walls what appears to be a forest. Then there's a teleporter maze. It's not Etrian Odyssey without a teleporter maze. The player soon catches up with the investigator, who is mutated like members of the Vanguard. After this, the guild is sent to hunt down some dangerous monsters that have appeared on the 1st Stratum. There are also new foes. These monsters are being sent from the depths, and currently there's no way to stop them. You get sent to fight one FOE on the 31st floor, then back to the 1st floor to deal with something that had apparently wiped out a large number of people. And it's this thing. It's a bit of a mess, but that kind of works as an aesthetic because it makes it look really bizarre and alien. At the same time, the design of its face makes it pretty clear it's related to the Ifrit. You also learn that the Ifrit and the boss you just fought are created by the same thing at the heart of the labyrinth that the military wants to take control of. And your investigation team seems to be treated as an enemy by whatever this is. And then after all that, it's finally back to exploring further into the 6th Stratum. And here we have another really interesting bit. You see, the walls of each floor of the 6th Stratum are different. In particular, the first 4 floors each represent the first 4 strata, almost like you're looking through the walls out into the earlier strata. Although the walls of the 5th floor break this pattern by being entirely black. This whole aesthetic actually kind of clashes with the enemies here, though. Here you have enemies designed for the strange organic 6th Stratum of the first game in this distinctly inorganic strange stratum. And fitting the rest of this game, there's not too much exciting in the actual Stratum exploration until the boss, which is another recolor of that weird thing you fought relatively recently. It's also apparently a pretty simple fight, using a couple attacks from the 6th Stratum boss of the first game. It also seems to alternate between what I think is a healing skill and a high damage single target attack. And that's it. Despite the 5 extra floors and going all the way through to the 6th Stratum, the game seems to have had something of a slower progression rate. Most of the players' characters were level 55 upon beating the final boss, a good 15 levels below the first game's cap of 70. But before I get to the conclusion, there is actually a bit more. This is an Etrian Odyssey game after all. There's gotta be a post-game. First, the 3 dragons. Yeah, these aren't the dragons you're expecting. They have this Rather cool, unique design, although at the same time they're all palette swaps of each other because, of course they are, this game loves palette swaps. They also have different names from the main series dragons, so it's very clear they're supposed to be entirely different. Also, there were these iron dragon enemies throughout the dungeon, which weren't that important, but I figured I'd mention them here. Pretty sure there's some palette swaps of these too, because once again, of course there are. And then of course, with those taken care of, there's a big final super boss. Its name apparently translates to either Valve Mass or more likely Bulb Mass, which I guess is vaguely plant themed and suggests some connection to Yggdrasil. Also, in one last bit of random weirdness from this game, it can apparently inflict confusion lasting as many as 20 turns. Yikes. But with that boss defeated, here we're at the real end. It's actually kind of cryptic, with NPCs worried about the existence of such strong monsters and worried about what could come next. But of course there is no continuation. And the way the story just kind of trails off like this is kind of unnerving to think about. It's kind of bleak and it kind of fits the series quite well. But now it's time to wrap this up. This is a weird game, if you couldn't tell by the fact that most of my comments on it are prefaced by me saying how weird something is. Overall, it's a bit mechanically simple since it mostly removes things from the main games due to technical limitations or just shoddy programming. The view distance is limited, there are none of the little events while exploring that give so much texture to the game. There's very little in the way of labyrinth gimmicks. Your back row doesn't automatically get moved forward when the front row eats it, which probably makes comebacks a little easier. Suspend saves don't record FOE locations, so you can cheese them that way. And the curse status effect only causes characters to suffer damage when they use normal attacks. If they use skills, they're fine, so it's much more of a non-issue. Honestly, most of the weirdness here is just things being randomly weird for no reason, like the stairs on the 21st floor, or the weird way you get from the 7th floor to the 9th floor. Very rarely does the game actually add to the mechanics of the series. There's some interesting powerful weapons, and there's this thing where enemies sometimes drop equipment instead of just materials. Usually it's much better than what you currently have access to. Plus there's the ability for multiple FOEs to appear in an encounter. I guess that's unique. The most interesting part of this game is some of the lore and stratum designs here. The last couple strata hint at something really weird and interesting, but the game itself is apparently very lacking in details. Then again, at some level being vague and uncertain is a staple of the series stories, but this game gives you even less than most of the other titles. The player behind these blog posts theorized that this could be a part of a project to save people from the catastrophe that set up the series by letting them escape to a cyberspace, only for things to go wrong and end up corrupting the people there. But ultimately, nothing is really too clearly spelled out here. Not helped by the fact that this was before the 3DS era, which is where the game's plots started to really get tied together more. So in the end, are we really missing out on much by not having this in the Origins collection? Well, that depends. Do you want a quality classic Etrian Odyssey experience? This probably isn't it. Between the wacky balance, heavy use of palette swaps, and many weird decisions like the 10-floor Stratum 3, yeah, this probably isn't the most enjoyable game to play through. But if you want a weird experience, yeah, totally, this is weird. And the whole point of Origins is to be able to appreciate the uniqueness of the early games and preserve them. So yeah, this game totally should have been in the Origins collection, or maybe get an Untold style remake. Really, in either case, it's such an obscure and janky game that they pretty much have free reign remaking it. But alas, it was not included. Perhaps it's not any great loss, but it's still a loss nonetheless. Aside from the simple moral value I and many others place on game preservation, this is one of my favorite game series, and I do enjoy weird and unique games. I probably would have been fascinated by this title, but odds are I'll never get to play it. But at the very least, I will do what I can to help share knowledge of Etrian Odyssey Mobile. Not only to spread the word and direct people to the blog I've been using for this, but also to create an additional copy of some of this information, just in case the playthrough in question goes offline someday. So, thank you for watching if you made it through all of this. Please consider giving the playthrough I used a read. There's a link in the description that will take you to the page with a machine translation frame, and there's plenty of other finer details I left out that you may find interesting. It's good to be back making these videos. I had to move house recently and that was incredibly disruptive, but I'm settled in now and so I'll hopefully be picking up the pace a little. Next videos in mind are more Phantasy Star and more Etrian Odyssey. Though I also have one thing that's a little different in the works, so you'll have to wait and see on that. But for now, take care, and I hope I will see you on the next video.